So just a warm welcome to everyone who is joining this seminar today. The seminar is brought to you courtesy of a collaboration between Imperial College London, University of Nairobi, and the African Speculative Society. And we have a series of open seminars that we've laid out for this year. And this quarter, we are delighted to have Dilman, Dila, to kickstart the seminar series for this quarter. Dilma is a writer and a film maker known for his impactful storytelling. And his notable works include the novel Where River Go to Die, shortlisted for the PKD Award in 2024, and The Future God of Love. Dilma has been shortlisted for nomination for the BSFA Awards, the Nomo Awards, for the Best Novella, and the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. His short stories have been featured in prestigious anthologies. In filmmaking, Dilma's achievements include a nomination for the Best First Feature by a Director at the African Movie Academy Award for the Felicitas Fable, and his short film What Happened in Room 13 has garnered over 8 million views on YouTube. His other acclaimed films include The Sound of One-Leg Dancing, which won the Jury Award at the Nepal International Indigenous Film Festival, and Her Broken Shadow, showcased at various international film festivals. So Dilma, I hand over to you.
Yes.
Please take it away. I'll share the screen again so we can see the slide.
To kick off. Yeah, I'll mostly be, hello? Are you saying something?
Take it away.
Okay, I'll mostly be talking about my inspirations for the works that I write, and how I research for the stories that I do, and then yeah, like basically inspirations, because I always want to ground things in reality as much as possible. So next slide. Yeah, I would say I'm kind of a multidisciplinary artist. I sometimes call myself a transmedia artist, and I create in multiple media, including films, of course, which take a lot of my time, but I also do a lot of writing. I started off as a writer, but I moved to film and other visual media to make money. Most of my works, of course, are science fictions, and I kind of base them on the cultures that I grew up in. Even when I try to create robots, like the character you're seeing on the screen, I'll try as much as possible to give it some kind of African aesthetics, or it's mostly the masks that we have in most of our cultures. But these masks, they were always representations of other kind of entities, and very much like robots. They are not human, but they are also human in some ways. And that's why I keep using them. But as an example of how I use, how I get inspired by my cultures. But next slide. When we talk about, science fiction, the big question that you'll have to ask yourself, like, what exactly is science fiction? And of course, there are many definitions, but the most prominent will probably be something science or a story that has some kind of fantastical science and technology in it. The science, the technology should not be existent, should not exist in the current world. But then you will ask, like, if the stories I write or the films I make are science fictions, because many of them could be fantasies, since there is kind of magic involved in them, or what people call magic, and or other people call spiritualism and all that. But then when I look at the knowledge systems that we have, I of course have to question whether what the definition of science is, or what the popular definition of science is. Of course, what we get about what we know about science, or our education system is mostly modeled on European knowledges and European and Middle Eastern knowledges, because I think everything we know about physics, chemistry, and everything, they will always trace it down to somebody who was maybe in the Middle East or in Europe, who had this theory, and then those theories became formula and stuff like that. But knowledges from other parts of the world were not considered much to be science or technology, and they were all rubbished as magic and juju and all that. So if I'm writing, or if I make a story about rainmakers in Uganda, where will that story fall? Will it be science fiction, or will it be a fantasy? So maybe by the end of this small talk, you'll probably look at my point of view and also agree that stories about rainmakers can be science fiction rather than fantasy, or yeah. So of course, next slide. Of course, in all the when we like what we are presented as the knowledges, or as the science in Africa, is always it's always boxed in divination and in what some people call juju, or other people call witchcraft, which are not good definitions of what it actually is. And of course, I struggled with this for a long time, because I was like, how do I create a science fiction and yet still have a person who, in English, they might call them shamans, but I like using the actual words that their peoples call them. Like in Kiswahili, it will be a mganga. In Acholi, it will be a jwara, because those terms kind of, if you say witch doctor, or if you say shaman, it doesn't exactly tell what these people were doing, because they were, of course, they were doctors, they were priests, they were a lot of psychologists, they were scientists. They encompassed a lot of things, which there's some kind of something is lost when it comes to when you try to translate it into English. So, but I always see these people as scientists, or I don't know, you could call them spiritual scientists or something, because next slide, when you look at this picture, it depicts a cesarean birth that was, or a cesarean operation that was carried out in Uganda, or present-day Uganda, but at that time it wasn't called Uganda. But this was happening in the 1800s, and documentary evidence says nobody in Europe was carrying out successfully carrying out cesarean operations at that time. So what you see here is like, I think the man was called Felkin, the European who witnessed this, and it's a popular image. If you search on the internet, you should find it somewhere, and you should be able to read about his story, Felkin. So he witnessed doctors in somewhere in Uganda carrying out a cesarean operation, and according to his notes, 11 days later, the woman, both the mother and child were saved, and the woman was working in her garden within 11 days, and he couldn't notice the stitches or the cut that was made. Like, the wound was completely healed, and she could work in her gardens at that time. So, of course, the way he describes it as some kind of religious ceremony, and he primitivized a lot of the things, like stating that the doctors were naked. I can't see why doctors will be naked when they are carrying this out. But yeah, there are some of those small things that made him rubbish it off. And of course, though it was in a science journal that this article was published, it was the kind of attitude that Europeans adopted whenever they met with technology from Africa. Next slide. But this was one of the first things that got me thinking really about what it means, what science is, and what technology really is. So the more I looked into traditional healers, for lack of a better word, the more I began seeing them as kind of scientists. And the more I thought about this image, the more I began to draw connections with what their other practices. Because one question that comes to mind is like, what instruments are they using to make the operation? And then how did they achieve this kind of skill in terms of, surgeons, they practice a lot before they eventually operate on a person. Next slide. And of course, when we, okay, this was just text I got from Felkin's notes, but the big thing that I've from my research, there's a kind of divination that was called, that's called Harus. I don't know how to pronounce that word, but it basically means divination by looking at entrails, by looking at the intestines of animals. So in Bunyoro, just very close to where this cesarean operation was witnessed, there was a divination system that was called Haruspi by Haruspis. I think it's called the Haruspex or something. Divination by examining the entrails. But then there are certain rules that these diviners had to follow in order to make a success. So I was talking about Haruspisi, or I don't know how to pronounce that. But yeah, I was talking about how diviners probably ended up carrying cesarean operations in Uganda at that time. And there is this kind of divination system where they have to operate like a chicken. But then there are rules that they had to follow as they are doing this operation. And some of it was that you didn't have to cut certain parts of the intestines, and you had to open the stomach of the chicken without touching any other thing. So, but the way it is described, I see it like the person needs to have a very precise, they have to have a very high skill of, of surgery. And I think maybe that kind of divination helped them to practice and eventually be able to do cesarean operations. It's a theory, it's not yet proved, but I think like if somebody probably did better research, they might they might end up drawing correlations between that and the Caesarean that Felkin observed. So next slide. It's hard now to know what okay, so divination. This brings me, of course, to divination. The next slide is, oh, it's an image I made. I was trying to recreate that. I was trying to recreate Felkin's observation of Felkin's drawing using 3D. Yeah, but next slide. Yes, so divination, like this, like that research, of course, got me very much interested in actual divination. And then one time I came across this book by Ron Eglash, and it kind of blew me away because his thesis was that the digital code we use in binary code today has its roots in a divination system that is very common all over Africa. And yeah, I could not investigate the other kinds of divinations, like the one where they cut chicken and all that, because there's still a lot of stuff like magic associated around it. And even if you try to ask the diviners to do something like that, they will not do it for fun. But other divinations, which I'm going to talk about shortly, or like which Ron Eglash says ended up contributing to the development of binary code, those are very common, and it's kind of they're very common and they're all over Africa. What he observed was the sun divination in among the Bambara in West Africa. Next slide. But okay, this slide was mostly summarizing how Ron Eglash came to the conclusion about the divination system, how it moved to Europe and then became geomancy, and then eventually it became a binary code. Next slide. So yes, the book, Eglash's book was mostly concerned with architecture. And of course, it is another kind of mathematics that has been ignored or that has not been explored properly, or the kind of things that were dismissed as not being, you know, knowledge, or because most Europeans, when they were looking at things like the fractal architecture in the continent, they thought people are imitating nature, and so there was nothing like mathematics in them. But when I look at things like this now, and people like Ron Eglash, probably someone could come up with a mathematical model or a mathematical formula that can illustrate this. Next slide. Or that can put this in a kind of knowledge. And this was me attempting to look at present day homes, or this was in Acholi, and then I was trying to see how fractals helped to organize society. Next, oh, I don't know why I put all these slides. Yeah. So yes, and also look, I got different views of the grass hut after looking at fractal architecture, because when you look at the grass hut, it's I think one of the most common architectures in Africa. But then it is easy to dismiss it as a primitive structure. But upon understanding fractal geometry, I began thinking of them more in terms of like the way somebody will think of, you know, high-end architecture. Next slide. And then so in this, some of the science fiction films that I create, the architectures that I try to or the aesthetics of the architecture will probably fit in something like this, or something inspired by this kind of fractal design. Next. I think go to the next slide. Yeah, okay, back to divination, because a lot of the divination systems that I was talking about are easier to investigate. And so this was in 2018 when I was discovering Ron Eglash, and then I tried to look at other divination systems that still go on today. And then this is one called, it's a shoe divination. It's common among the pastoralists in northeastern Uganda. They are called the Karamojong. But yeah, when I looked at divination systems, Ron Eglash had some mathematical names for them. He was saying things like, you know, deterministic chaos, stochastic, or the theory of probability, to try to understand or to try and come up with models around this kind of thing. But then, so I needed like a first-hand experience of how divination works. And if when I examined like what a lot of these things mean or how it happens, there is always an if then kind of thing, like if this happens then, or if it is such and such, then this and that will happen. Next. And I think when I tried to look at this was me basically trying to implement or trying to put Ron Eglash's suppositions in practice. And I was here asking myself, like, can you create computer code from these divination systems that we have? And of course, I tried to put some diagrams and of what like when you're doing this divination, the shoe divination, there are certain ways that your shoe can fall. How it happens is you throw the sandal into the air and then you let it fall. And how the sandals fall in the ground will tell you something about what is going to happen in the very near future. So there are some positions, like if you see they are facing each other, this figure number 3 in the 3D recreation, it means you'll have, when the toes of the sandals are facing each other, it means you'll have a joyful conversation with somebody you meet. The images on the black and white images, they are taken from an old book written in 1921 by, I forget his name, but the title of the book is called The Lango. And he put down a lot of this kind of shoe divination. But you can still see where I'm going with the coding thing, because if you see an image, if the shoe falls like this, you can translate that design of how the shoe is falling into some kind of image, and then that image will can generate some kind of code. Because so if you see this, if you see a shoe or this kind of symbols, then this is going to happen. I think that is how people do coding, or how they write code. I tried to learn coding early on, but then I gave up because I don't know if I had the head for it. But next slide. So in a lot of, oh yeah, there's somebody who has actually done coding for taking African designs and African knowledge systems and African stuff and try to make code out of it. I think this research was headed by Tegan Bristow if you Google, you might come up. I think her website will come up. She's a lecturer. I don't know if she still does the lecturing, but in South Africa. And what they did was they were trying to generate code out of the beadwork of the South African people, the Zulus, the Xhosa, and all those nations. And I've had her give her talk. I think if you went online, you might get some of her presentations. But this is a screenshot from her website, and you could maybe read more about it. But then this inspired me to create the visual depictions of code in my films. So this is, if you look at the image here on the film, there is like when you look at code, computer code in films, of course, there is always numbers, and the numbers are always running down. But then I started creating code that looks like beadwork after interacting with Tegan Bristow's research. Next slide. Yeah, and so in films like this, I kind of add like imagining what would computers have looked like if they were, if we had, if our knowledge systems had been allowed to, to flourish without being interrupted or without being dismissed as gibberish. So what you're looking at is a mirror, and I'm thinking of the mirror as some kind of input device, and then the small beads on the mirror are representatives of shells, like the shells that a diviner might throw on a mat when they are doing the divination things. Of course, I put it next to a keyboard just to emphasize that this is a vision of what an input device might have looked like. And yeah, it's a mixture basically of that kind of it's a mixture of divination and the theory about divinations, how they led computer code, and the computers that we have in the present day. In this film, which you can find online, there is a young woman who goes about trying to actively research divinations and create a programming language out of the divination system. And then it's this programming language that gives her pet robot a sentient life, or gives it like some kind of artificial intelligence. Next slide. So this was in a film I did in 2019. Of course, this was when I was just figuring out this whole thing, but it's again another way of how I use Tegan's beadwork to code kind of thing in my works. But then at the end of the day, it is when you go back to the theme of the lecture, can science fiction inspire technological change in Africa? Maybe presenting things like this in works of fiction will probably trigger somebody else to be curious, and yeah, take those kinds of theories and maybe come up with actual stuff that can work. Next slide. So there are other books that I've begun reading, and they're all about all these alternative kind of mathematics. I think the term for it is ethnomathematics. But yeah, there are a lot of scholars who are figuring out like what kind of mathematics do we get from African knowledge systems and things like that. And these are just two examples. I've not yet read them in depth, but then I'm going to be getting into them more, and maybe I'll use a lot of stuff from there in my coming works. Next. So this brings me now to another thing that I've been researching for a while, and that is rainmakers. Yeah, because this is still the one that is shrouded with a lot of mystery. But then, and I always thought there's something very scientific in the way rainmakers work. Next, and the best evidence is in there is a community in northern Kenya, western Kenya called the Ng'anyi. If you go to Google, to YouTube, you're going to find the documentary about them. But then this kind of summarizes what rainmaking really is. Because, of course, people will say this person has magical powers, they can stop rain, they can make rain. But what it really is having a very keen observation of nature. Like the rainmakers of Ng'anyi would observe animals, plants, and they say animals will know it's going to rain before, like I don't know if they have sensors in their bodies or they have something, but yeah. So we're talking about rainmakers and how their work is actually very much like science. When you look at this video, you will one of the how do they call those guys who study weather? Geologists. One of the geologists says that what these people are doing is very similar to what them as geologists use in predicting the weather, like the tools that they have with them. He mentions one or two tools that they use, but then every other rainmaker that you know, or if they try to tell you, or that I've heard of, if they try to tell you their secrets, it will come down to just it will come down to them being very keen observers of the weather, and of course not just observers, but they will study the weather. I mean, they will study the nature around them. They will study animals. They will study the wind. They will study everything to be able to predict to be able to predict rain accurately. Actually, with these Ng'anyi rainmakers, the geologists they did the tests. I mean, they did the study, and the predictions of the Ng'anyi rainmakers were as accurate as of the weather forecasts from the geological stations. Next. So I've tried to research into rainmaking in the past, like what has been said about rainmaking, what has been written about it, but there is very little that has been documented, and most of it, of course, has been rubbished as like the way Felkin did. But Felkin was actually much more scientific in his observations. But then the other people who were writing about rainmaking, they were always writing about it as some kind of, voodoo practice, and they never looked at it as a science. But when I read about them, there is always some tools that they use, and rainmaking stones. It's a concept that is that keeps coming up in many of these rainmakers, especially the rainmakers of the past. This is the image you're seeing is from a book called Victoria Nyanza, about someone who was traveling somewhere in northern Tanzania, but then he's drawn a rainmaking stone, or like an apparatus for rainmaking. There are two pots somewhere with herbs in them, and then there is a flat stone with a hole in the middle of the stone. The rainmaking stones I've heard of from Acholi said they came from the bottom of a river, and you couldn't touch them with your bare hands, and like unless you got some kind of, how do they call it, not vaccine, because I don't know if you can be vaccinated against touching poisonous minerals. But then what came to my mind when I read about these anecdotes about rainmaking is that those stones probably had minerals in them. And of course, when you read about some of the rainmaking practices, there involves burning of certain herbs, specific herbs. And when I consider all this knowledge, and then I consider what we know today as cloud seeding, which scientists try to, whereby scientists try to influence the weather by, I don't know, sprinkling chemicals into clouds. It makes me think about the rainmakers more than just being juju or fantasy stuff. But I've not yet got a lot of practical information that I can say the way I've done with divination, and apply this in a way that looks, apart from, of course, the case with the Ngani, and them being able to observe the weather the way weather forecasting machines do. I've not yet been able to get much more from the science point of view of how they actually would make rain and how they would stop rain, because this still happens up to today. But when I examine their practices, there's always burning involved. There is one that I heard of where they have to go on top of a hill or a mountain to burn some herbs that are in a pot. But it makes me think that maybe whatever was in these pots will when they burn it, it will go into the sky and create enough chemical or to stop rain, or to make rain fall, or to do something of that kind. But yeah, it's still a work in progress, and maybe other researchers can really get into it, or people with better research, because me, when I do the research, 50% is looking at books, and the other 50 is me thinking through it. Next slide. Yeah, I don't remember where I put this, but it's one of my artwork, which is really about I'm not going to interpret this, but yeah, so I think it brings us close to the end of what I had prepared to present, which is how can the past inspire change today? But the question, of course, why I look at the past, why I keep writing stories set in the past or heavily inspired the past, is not, of course, to turn back the clock of time and we go back to the 1800s and live the way we were back then. But yeah, what can we learn? What can the past teach us about today? Ronek, in his book, he was kind of suggesting that fractal geometry can help with urban planning, because if you look at very many urban centers in Africa today, or a lot of them are not planned like the way you'll find, I forget the name, like the way the streets are always straight and then you can go from one street to another street. But then you'll find in some cities or in some suburbs, there is no clear, like where the street starts and where it ends. The roads are always meandering. Wherever there is a space, somebody puts the road, and then you find houses are not facing each other. But there was certain logic in that kind of urban planning. But if we try maybe to use fractal geometry, or if somebody figures out a method or a formula for using fractal geometry in this kind of thing, maybe it will help with planning, even just giving addresses to like postal addresses, or giving street names and things like that. But what has captured my mind in the last few years has been decentralized governance, because I've been reading a lot about it. And I know when we talk of science fiction, we only think of the technologies and we never think of science. I mean, the society itself and just the systems that are in the society. But I always think like science fiction will be more than just technology, but also the institutions that are in the society and institutions that can come from a society. So when I look at most of African communities, they never had centralized leadership. Like, for example, in Uganda, out of 52 nations that the British put together to call Uganda, only about between 6 and 10 had centralized leadership in the form of an absolute monarch. But the others, they all had very, very decentralized systems. And of course, when the British came and they found this kind of decentralized governance, they dismissed them as primitive, because we know, like, the theory in Europe at that point was civilizations move from band societies, hunter-gatherers, then they keep progressing until they reach the highest state, which was the cities, the state, the nation state, and then maybe it goes on to empires, and then it becomes, if you look at some of the science fictions like The Expanse and Star Wars, they imagine, like a whole galaxy is under the control of one entity or one institution. But of course, this is not very helpful to human development. And if we look back, we can see that civilizations can exist and they can thrive without centralized governance. So looking at government systems that existed in many parts of
Dilma,
Africa back then. Yes?
Dilma, we will need to leave some time for questions, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, I'd actually maybe wound up. I was actually now rambling. It's a nice place to stop. I mean, the questions are already there and they're kind of self-explanatory. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, we could maybe take questions.
Yeah, so maybe we can open the floor for questioning. If anybody has a question to Dilma, particularly the students the students from Nairobi University who are joining us today, it will be good to get that going. I see a hand from Ma'am. Please go ahead, Ma'am.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dilman, for the presentation. I had a quick question on haruspicy in Uganda. I was wondering if there were sources online that delved into the practice so I could read up on it a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if you Google divination in Bunyoro, you might come up with a few. There was somebody, I think he was called John Beatty. Let me just try and see if I can get his name. Oh, it's actually somewhere in my archives. Yeah, there was a person called Beatty. He did a very in-depth, I'll type his name in the, I'll type his name in the chat. His is one of the texts that I used to learn about the haruspicy and all that. But there should be other texts also. just about divination in no, Okot Pabitek didn't go into big details about how it works, but this is the best example of how you can read into it and get into, because Biti spent a lot of time in Bunyoro and he studied a lot of the different kinds of divinations that happen there.